For those of you who think that the state of North Carolina is the only one that's trying to seriously impact minorities, specifically black people's right to vote, I got another thing for you. The Department of Justice recently caught Texas violating the court order against its voter suppression law. Texas was taken to court and lost in its voter suppression laws in its Court of Appeals. It appealed that decision to the Supreme Court, which, as most of us know, is tied 4-4, so that appeal was lost. Based on the lower court ruling, Texas was supposed to make changes back to the original laws before Section 5 was struck down. Okay, Texas is currently violating a court order intended to prevent it from suppressing the vote, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. In July, a federal appeals court held that Texas's voter ID law, a common method of voter suppression, violates the Voting Rights Act. They were sued under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which is a lot harder to prevail under. In response, Texas agreed to be bound by a court order during the upcoming election that offered a workaround for voters who cannot reasonably obtain ID. The key word is reasonably obtain ID. The court order provided that registered voters who present a valid voter registration certificate, a certified birth certificate, a current utility bill, a bank statement, a government check, a paycheck, or any other government document that displays the voter's name and address may cast a regular vote so long as they sign a reasonable impediment declaration. That's a document stating that the voter was not reasonably able to obtain the forms of ID mandated by the illegal Texas law. Additionally, the court order provides that the state must educate voters in subsequent elections concerning the opportunity for voters who do not possess SB 14 ID, and that's a list of IDs that may or may not be easily obtained. That ID, by the way, does not include a state university ID, so it impacts students. It also said that the person cannot reasonably obtain it to cast a regular ballot. And again, the word is reasonably, okay? Yet, according to a Justice Department motion filed on Tuesday, Texas is not complying with this order. Texas's press releases, voter education materials, and poll worker training manuals claim that the right to vote extends only to voters who comply with the illegal law, those who have not obtained or cannot obtain an ID. When they go with the phraseology cannot, that opens a can of worms bigger than all of outdoors, because if you have an issue and you don't go to court to either change your name legally, obtain a birth certificate that may or may not exist depending on your circumstances, etc. As the Department of Justice notes, this cannot obtain standard appears to forbid voters impacted by the voter suppression law from voting unless it is literally impossible for them to obtain an ID. But that's not what the court order said, and it is a distinction that could potentially disenfranchise many voters. A voter is only slightly more likely to be attacked by a fire-breathing dragon than they are to commit in-person voter fraud. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Eric Kenney, a Texas voter who was disenfranchised by the Texas law in 2014. As the Guardian's Ed Pinkerton reported, Kenney attempted to get the ID he needed to vote under the Texas law. Indeed, he made multiple trips to the state office that issues such IDs. Yet, because Kenney does not drive and he lives in a low-income area without easy access to this office, each trip involving taking 3 buses, a journey that could stretch up to a couple of hours, then Kenney arrived at the office. He had to stand in line waiting for up to a further 3 hours to be seen, before finally making another 2-hour schlep home. Each time Kenney made this trip, he was told that he lacked paperwork he was required to present in order to obtain an ID. Eventually, he gave up after he was refused an ID because his birth certificate listed his last name as Carruthers, his mother's maiden name, not Kenney, the name of his father. But was it really impossible for Kenney to obtain an ID? Could Kenney comply with Texas's cannot obtain standard rather than the court order's less rigid cannot reasonably obtain standard? It is far from clear that it was literally impossible for Kenney to obtain ID. He could have attempted to hire legal counsel and pursued his voting rights that way, or he could have accepted that his legal name is now Eric Carruthers, a step he refused to take because he viewed it as an insult to his father. Or perhaps he could have attempted to legally change his name to Kenney, the name he has always used, and then take another multi-hour trip attempting to obtain ID once again. In order to legally change his name to Kenney would have cost him somewhere between $200 and $300. Texas's cannot obtain standard suggests that he is required to jump through these hoops if he wishes to vote, but that is not what the court order said. As Kenney's case suggests, voter ID laws have a disproportionate impact on low-income voters as well as people of color and students, all of which are groups that tend to prefer Democrats over Republicans. And though voter ID defenders often claim that such laws are necessary to prevent voter fraud at the polls, a voter is only slightly more likely to be attacked by a fire-breathing dragon than they are to commit in-person voter fraud. A Wisconsin study found just 7 cases of fraud among the 3 million votes cast in the state's 2004 election, and none were the kind of fraud that would be prevented by a voter ID law. Similarly, in 2014, Iowa Secretary of State Matt Schultz's 2-year investigation into election misconduct within his state uncovered 0 cases of in-person voter fraud. Yet, while such laws ostensibly target a problem that does not exist, they do shift the electorate as a whole rightward. In 2012, data journalist Nate Silver estimated a voter ID law could reduce President Obama's margin against Mitt Romney by a net of 1.2 percentage points. A more recent study found much greater results, determining that Democratic turnout drops by an estimated 8.8 percentage points in general elections when strict photo identification laws are in place, as opposed to just 3.6% for Republicans. So, there's just another example of the quote-unquote righteous Republicans who are so concerned about non-existent voter fraud, but in actuality, what they're trying to do is reduce the minority black vote and also the student vote in order to tilt the playing field to Republican candidates for whichever office is up for election at that point in time.